quiet morning, a peaceful cafe, until everything changes in an instant. When danger walks through the door, how far would you go to stand against injustice? And who will step up when the line is crossed? Watch till the end to witness a moment you won't forget. What would you have done in this situation? Like the video, leave a comment, and don't forget to subscribe for more gripping stories. The city was still asleep. The sky remained dark, the faint glow of dawn barely visible on the horizon. The streets were nearly empty, save for a few cars passing by, their headlights cutting through the chilly morning air. Traffic lights flickered between red and green, illuminating the wet pavement with a dim glow. A black Dodge Charger rolled to a slow stop in front of a small corner cafe. The engine idled for a moment before shutting off, leaving only the distant hum of the city in its wake. The driver's door opened, and Vin Diesel stepped out. He adjusted his leather jacket, took a quick glance around, and headed toward the entrance. The cafe was still closed. The sign on the glass door clearly read, "Closed," and inside, the lights remained off. Vin checked his watch. He knew he was early. He always was. He preferred the silence of these early hours when the world hadn't fully woken up yet. No crowds, no cameras, no unwanted attention. Just him, a strong cup of coffee, and a few minutes of peace. A few minutes passed before the sound of footsteps echoed down the sidewalk. He knew who it was before even turning around. The jingling of keys, the click of a lock, and the cafe door slowly creaked open. Stepping inside was Katrina, the cafe's young barista. She quickly switched on the lights, filling the small space with a warm glow. Her dark curls were tied back into a loose ponytail, and despite the early hour, a smile played on her lips. "Good morning, Mr. Diesel," she said cheerfully, setting her bag down behind the counter. Vin raised an eyebrow, his gaze steady. "You're late today." Katrina let out a dramatic gasp, pressing a hand to her chest. "Late? Me? Never!" She laughed, locking the door behind her. "Maybe a minute or two, but I'm still faster than most." Vin smirked slightly. "Debatable." "Oh, come on, don't start being grumpy already," she teased, tying her apron around her waist. "Your usual." "As always." She immediately got to work, her hands moving with the ease of routine. "You always come in so early," she noted while filling the filter with fresh coffee grounds. "Even before me, sometimes." Vin leaned on the counter, watching her work. "Fewer people, no distractions." "Yeah, I get that. You should see this place during the rush hours. It's chaos. I'd come in early too if I could." Vin simply nodded, taking the cup she handed him. He walked to his usual seat in the back of the cafe, unfolded a newspaper, and took his first sip. The coffee was strong, just the way he liked it. The quiet hum of the espresso machine and the occasional clinking of cups were the only sounds that filled the space. Then the peace was broken. The cafe door slammed open, hitting the wall with a loud thud. 3 men in leather jackets and heavy boots stormed inside, their loud voices tearing through the quiet atmosphere. Vin slowly lowered his newspaper. The leader, a tall man with a scruffy gray beard, lazily scanned the room before his gaze locked onto Katrina. His lips curled into a sneer. "Well, well, well. Would you look at that?" he said, his voice dripping with mockery. The other 2 bikers snickered as they took seats at the counter. "Where the hell are we, boys?" The blonde one smirked. "I thought we were in a cafe, not a charity." Katrina didn't flinch. She calmly turned to them, her expression neutral. "Good morning. Can I take your order?" The second biker, a younger man with tattoos covering his arms, leaned in closer, squinting at her name tag. "You even know how to make coffee?" he snorted. "Or do they just let anyone off the streets work here now?" Vin watched carefully, his gaze unreadable. "If you're ordering, I'll be happy to serve you," Katrina said, her voice steady. "Otherwise, please let the other customers enjoy their morning." The leader smirked and leaned forward, planting his hands on the counter. "You got some nerve, girl," he muttered, voice low. "People like you should know their place." Katrina's jaw tightened slightly, but she didn't break eye contact. The leader suddenly grabbed a nearby coffee cup and threw it at her. The hot liquid splashed onto her apron, staining the fabric. She didn't move. Her calm, unwavering gaze seemed to unnerve him. "You think you're tough?" the leader growled, reaching into his jacket. A flash of metal. A knife. He barely had time to react before Vin Diesel was already on his feet. The bikers turned at the sudden movement. Vin stood in the center of the cafe, his broad frame casting a long shadow across the floor. His expression was calm, too calm. "That's enough." His voice cut through the tension like a blade. The leader squinted at him, still gripping the knife. "And who the hell are you supposed to be?" Vin took one slow step forward, his gaze locked onto the man. "I'm the guy who's given you a chance to leave." The bikers exchanged glances before bursting into laughter. The blond one clapped his hands mockingly. "Oh, look, we got ourselves a hero. What are you going to do, big guy? Lecture us?" Vin didn't blink. "You have two choices," he said calmly. "You leave now." A pause. "Or you leave after I make you." The leader stepped closer, knife still raised. Big talk for someone who's about to get hurt. Vin remained still, his voice dropping to a near growl. "Try me." The cafe held its breath. The biker lunged. Vin moved first. With a quick, precise motion, he sidestepped, grabbed the man's wrist, and twisted sharply. The knife clattered to the floor as the biker let out a pained grunt. Before the others could react, Vin struck. A brutal elbow to the ribs sent the leader crashing into a table. The blond biker cursed and rushed forward. Vin caught his punch, twisting his arm and slamming him face first into the counter. The third biker hesitated. Too late. Vin grabbed his collar, yanked him forward, and drove a knee into his stomach. The man collapsed, gasping for air. The cafe erupted into chaos. Some customers scrambled for the door, others pulled out their phones, recording. Katrina stood frozen, her eyes wide as she processed what had just happened. The leader groaned, pulling himself up off the floor, his face red with rage. "You think you can just walk in here and humiliate us?" he spat. Vin's expression remained unreadable. "You've already lost. Don't make it worse." The sound of police sirens cut through the air. Someone had called the cops. The bikers staggered to their feet, defeated, but the leader shot Vin one last murderous glare. "This isn't over." They bolted for the door, slipping out just as the first police car pulled up. Vin adjusted his jacket and turned back toward Katrina. "You okay?" She nodded slowly. "I think so." Vin gave a small nod, then glanced toward the arriving officers. "You'll be okay from here." He turned toward the exit, stepping out into the morning light. The cafe buzzed with murmurs, but one thing was clear. Vin Diesel had left an unforgettable mark on everyone in the room. The cafe was left in stunned silence after the bikers fled. The customers who had witnessed the scene whispered among themselves, some still clutching their phones, others frozen in place. Katrina stood behind the counter, her breathing shallow, her hands gripping the edge of the counter so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The smell of spilled coffee mixed with the lingering tension in the air. Vin Diesel remained standing near the knocked-over tables, his expression unreadable, his stance still loose but controlled, ready for anything. The police sirens grew louder as 2 squad cars pulled up outside. The red and blue lights flashed against the cafe's windows, signaling the arrival of order. A tall man in a dark trench coat stepped out of one of the vehicles. Detective Alvarez. His sharp eyes scanned the cafe through the glass before he pushed open the door and stepped inside, his expression unreadable. Vin glanced at him but didn't move. Alvarez had the look of a man who had seen too much trouble in his career, and he wasn't eager to add more to his list. He adjusted his coat, took in the scattered chairs, the broken coffee cups, and finally let his gaze settle on Vin Diesel. "Tell me you're just here for coffee, Diesel," Alvarez said, his tone flat. Vin shrugged. "Started that way." Alvarez sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Of course it did." He turned to Katrina, who was still standing rigidly behind the counter. "Miss, are you all right?" Katrina blinked a few times as if snapping back into the moment. She nodded. Yeah, I'm fine." One of the uniformed officers approached Vin. "Sir, we're going to need you to come outside and answer some questions." Vin exhaled slowly, nodding once before following the officer out onto the sidewalk. The early morning air was crisp, cutting through the tension that still clung to the cafe. Alvarez followed, pulling out a small notepad as he stood beside Vin. "All right, let's start from the beginning," Alvarez said, flipping to a blank page. "What exactly happened here?" Vin kept his answers short and to the point. He explained how the bikers had stormed in, harassing Katrina, escalating to threats, and how he had stepped in when one of them pulled a knife. Alvarez listened carefully, his pen scratching against the paper. Occasionally, he glanced up, watching Vin's face for any sign of deception, but there was none. When Vin finished, Alvarez closed his notebook with a quiet snap. "You know," he said, tucking it into his coat pocket, "this would have been a hell of a lot easier if you just stayed out of it." Vin met his gaze, his voice calm but firm. "And let them do whatever they wanted? Not my style." Alvarez exhaled through his nose. "Yeah, I figured." He turned as 2 officers walked out of the cafe, one of them holding the knife that had been left behind. The officer showed it to Alvarez, who studied it before glancing back at Vin. "This was theirs?" Vin nodded. "Leader pulled it." Alvarez muttered something under his breath before motioning for the officer to bag the weapon as evidence. He turned back to Vin. "You know, these guys aren't just some random punks looking for trouble, right?" Vin didn't respond. Alvarez narrowed his eyes. "They belong to a crew called the Iron Fangs. Been running around town for a while now, shaking down businesses, picking fights with people who don't play along. Your little stunt just made them lose face in front of an entire cafe full of witnesses. You think they're going to let that go?" Vin's expression didn't change. "If they come back, I'll be here." Alvarez let out a quiet laugh, but there was no humor in it. "Yeah, I bet you will, but you might want to think twice about that. The Iron Fangs don't take kindly to humiliation, and you just gave their leader a reason to make things personal." Vin didn't break eye contact. If he's dumb enough to try, he'll regret it. Alvarez studied him for a long moment before shaking his head. "You're either the bravest guy in this city or the most stubborn. Probably both." He glanced back toward the cafe where Katrina was still talking to an officer inside. "What about her? You think they're just going to forget she was here too?" Vin's jaw tightened slightly. He knew Alvarez was right. Katrina had stood up to those guys, and now she was on their radar. The Iron Fangs weren't just going to let that slide. Alvarez sighed. Look, I'll put in a patrol request to keep an eye on this place for a few days, but that's not going to stop them if they really want payback. He looked at Vin again. You sure you're not planning on leaving town anytime soon? Vin didn't answer right away. He glanced back in the cafe at Katrina, who was watching them through the window. Then he looked back at Alvarez. No, he said simply. Alvarez exhaled. Didn't think so. He gestured toward the cafe. Go check on her. I've got a few more things to take care of here. Vin nodded once before heading back inside. Katrina looked up as he entered, her eyes searching his face for answers. What did they say? They'll keep an eye on the place for now, Vin replied, but this isn't over. She swallowed hard. I figured. Vin watched her for a moment. She was holding herself together well, but he could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers fidgeted slightly against the counter. You handled yourself well, he said. Katrina let out a short laugh. Yeah? Didn't feel like it. Vin tilted his head slightly. Could have been worse. She exhaled, shaking her head. That's becoming the theme of today. Vin leaned on the counter slightly. You thinking about leaving? She stiffened. No. He nodded. Good. She gave him a skeptical look. What about you? Vin's lips twitched slightly. I'll be around. Before Katrina could respond, the cafe door opened again as Alvarez stepped back inside. He looked around, his eyes landing on Katrina. You'll need to come down to the station later to give an official statement. Shouldn't take long. Katrina nodded. Okay. Alvarez then turned to Vin. And you? Vin arched an eyebrow. You need me too? Alvarez sighed. I probably should, but I get the feeling you're not the type to sit around answering questions if you don't have to. Vin smirked slightly, but said nothing. Alvarez shook his head. All right, just stay out of trouble. Vin didn't respond as Alvarez headed back out the door. Katrina leaned against the counter, exhaling. So, that's it? They just leave and pretend this never happened? Vin took a slow sip of his coffee before setting the cup down. No, she frowned. Then what happens now? Vin glanced toward the window, watching as the last police car pulled away. His voice was quiet but firm. They come back. The air in the cafe felt heavy long after the police had left. Katrina wiped the counter with slow, deliberate movements, trying to steady herself. Her hands still trembled slightly, though she refused to let it show. She had always dealt with rude customers before, even outright racist ones, but today had been different. Today, the hostility had turned into something more dangerous, something real. She glanced toward Vin Diesel, who remained seated at his usual table, his cup of coffee in front of him, untouched now. He was calm, as if the chaos of the morning hadn't fazed him at all. But Katrina wasn't fooled. You really think they'll come back? She asked, breaking the silence. Vin didn't look up from his coffee. I don't think. I know. Katrina swallowed hard, gripping the towel in her hands. Great. Just what I needed. Vin finally lifted his gaze, his expression unreadable. You scared? Katrina's first instinct was to say no, but she stopped herself. She was scared. Maybe not just for herself, but for the cafe, for the people who worked here, for the customers who came in every day without thinking about whether or not they were safe. I don't want to be, she admitted. Vin nodded slowly, as if he respected the honesty. Before either of them could say anything else, the door to the cafe swung open again. But this time it wasn't a biker stepping inside. It was Tony, the cafe's owner. A middle-aged man with a round belly, graying hair, and a permanent look of worry on his face. He froze as he saw the mess, the overturned chairs, the broken cups, the stain of spilled coffee on the floor. His eyes darted between Katrina and Vin, then back to Katrina. "What the hell happened here?" Katrina sighed, tossing the towel over her shoulder. "We had some unwelcome guests." Tony frowned. "Who?" Vin leaned back slightly. "Bikers, 3 of them." Tony paled. "The Iron Fangs?" Vin's eyes narrowed slightly. "You've heard of them." Tony exhaled sharply, running a hand through his thinning hair. "They've been making the rounds, harassing shop owners, demanding protection fees. A few places already caved. I figured it was only a matter of time before they came here." He turned to Katrina. "Did they hurt you?" Katrina shook her head. "No, but they tried." Tony rubbed his face. "Damn it, this is bad. This is really bad." Vin studied him. "You already paying them?" Tony hesitated. "No, I refused, but I also didn't think they'd escalate this fast. I thought maybe they'd just keep pressuring, not whatever this was." Vin was quiet for a moment before asking, "They ever come in before today?" Katrina and Tony exchanged glances. Katrina shook her head. "No, at least not while I was here." Tony sighed. "They don't like being embarrassed. You stand up to them once and they make sure you regret it." He looked at Vin. "I assume you were the one who put them in their place?" Vin didn't respond immediately, but the look in Tony's eyes said he already knew the answer. Tony let out a shaky breath. "Then we're in trouble." Katrina straightened. "We?" Tony gave her a pointed look. "You think they're just going to come after him?" He gestured at Vin. "They'll come after all of us. The cafe, the employees. Hell, they might even go after some of our regulars just to send a message." The thought made Katrina's stomach turn. Vin, however, remained unfazed. "So, what's your plan?" Tony hesitated. "I don't know. Maybe I should just pay them. If it keeps people safe." "No." Vin's voice was flat, final. Tony blinked. "No?" Vin leaned forward slightly, his expression cold. "You pay them once, you pay them forever. It won't stop." Tony swallowed hard, clearly conflicted. "Then what do I do? Call the cops? We both know they won't be able to do anything until it's too late." Vin's jaw tightened slightly. He knew Tony was right. The police had already come and gone, but that wouldn't stop the Iron Fangs from coming back. If anything, it would make them angrier. Katrina looked at Vin carefully. "You've dealt with people like them before, haven't you?" Vin didn't answer. He didn't have to. Tony sighed. "So what? We just wait for them to show up again?" Vin's eyes darkened. "Number, we get ready." Tony stared at him for a long moment, then exhaled, rubbing his forehead. "Fine. Do what you gotta do. Just don't let this place turn into a war zone, okay?" Vin gave a slight nod. Tony turned to Katrina. "You sure you want to keep working?" She lifted her chin. "I'm not leaving." Tony studied her for a second before nodding. "All right, let's hope we don't regret this." As Tony walked toward the back office, Vin turned back to Katrina. "You got cameras in here?" Katrina nodded. "Yeah, why?" "Check the footage. Get a good look at those guys." She hesitated but then nodded, disappearing into the back. Vin turned toward the front window, staring out at the street. The sun was fully up now, casting golden light over the sidewalk. People were starting their day, unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface. He had seen this before. He had lived this before, and he knew one thing for sure. This wasn't over. The night was quiet. Too quiet. The usual late-night customers had already cleared out, and the cafe had closed hours ago. Katrina stood behind the counter, wiping down surfaces and checking the register one last time before heading out. The lights inside were dimmed, casting long shadows against the walls. The only sound was the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the building settling. Vin Diesel sat in the back of the cafe, arms crossed, his eyes scanning the street outside through the large front window. He hadn't left since earlier that morning. His instincts told him something was coming, and instincts were rarely wrong. Katrina noticed him watching. "You don't have to stay, you know," she said, trying to sound casual. Vin didn't respond immediately. He tapped a slow rhythm against the table with his fingers before finally speaking. "They'll be back. Probably not tonight, but soon. They won't let this go." Katrina sighed, rolling her shoulders. "Yeah, I figured." She hesitated, glancing at him. "How do you know?" Vin's gaze didn't shift from the window. "Because I've seen it before." A cold shiver ran down Katrina's spine at the certainty in his voice. Before she could ask more, a noise from outside made both of them tense. The sound of a motorcycle engine, followed by another, then a third. The low, menacing rumble echoed through the street as the headlights cut through the darkness. Katrina felt her stomach drop. "That's them, isn't it?" Vin stood up, his movements slow, controlled. He stepped toward the window, watching as the iron fangs pulled up in front of the cafe. 5 of them this time, not just the 3 from before, reinforcements. The leader, the same man who had pulled a knife on Katrina that morning, climbed off his bike first. He wasn't smiling now. His face was twisted with pure rage. One of the others carried a metal pipe. Another held what looked like a crowbar. "They're not here for coffee," Katrina muttered. Vin turned his head slightly. "Stay here. Don't come outside." Before Katrina could argue, he was already moving toward the door. She swallowed hard, her heart pounding as she peeked around the counter. Vin pushed open the door and stepped outside, his presence like a wall of stone. The bikers spread out slightly, surrounding him in a loose semicircle. The leader took a step forward, his voice dripping with venom. "You really should have minded your own business, Diesel." Vin didn't react. "You're trespassing." The leader laughed, shaking his head. "Nah, see? That's where you're wrong. This whole damn street belongs to us. And you?" His eyes darkened. "You made us look weak. Can't have that." The man with the pipe tapped it against his palm. "Boss says we teach you a lesson." Vin rolled his shoulders, exhaling. "You sure you want to do this?" the leader sneered. "We're past asking." And then they charged. The man with the pipe swung first, aiming for Vin's ribs. Too slow. Vin sidestepped, grabbed the man's wrist, and twisted. A sickening crack echoed through the street as the biker screamed, dropping the weapon. Vin didn't let go. He drove an elbow into the man's jaw, sending him crashing onto the pavement. The second attacker came in with the crowbar. Vin ducked the first swing, caught the biker by the jacket, and slammed him into the hood of a parked car. The impact left a deep dent, and the man groaned, rolling onto the ground, barely conscious. The leader roared in frustration and lunged with a knife, but Vin was already moving. He blocked the attack, grabbing the man's wrist and delivering a brutal knee to his gut. The leader stumbled back, wheezing. "You son of a..." Before he could finish, Vin sent a right hook straight into his jaw. The biker hit the ground hard, gasping for air. The last 2 hesitated, looking between their fallen crew and Vin, who stood unfazed, barely winded. Then, without another word, they turned and ran back to their bikes, engines roaring as they sped off into the night. The leader groaned, still on the ground, glaring up at Vin. You don't know what you've done." Vin crouched beside him, his voice deadly calm. I know exactly what I've done. And if you come back, I'll do worse." The leader's breathing was ragged, his expression a mix of pain and fury. He spat blood onto the pavement. "This ain't over," he growled. Vin didn't blink. "Yeah, it is." Inside the cafe, Katrina had been watching the entire time, barely breathing. As Vin stepped back inside, she stared at him, her hands gripping the edge of the counter. Are you even human?" she breathed. Vin smirked slightly, shaking his head. "Just a guy who doesn't like bullies." The distant sound of sirens filled the air. Someone must have called the cops. Vin turned toward Katrina. "Go lock the door." She didn't hesitate. As the flashing lights appeared down the street, Vin sat back down at his usual table, as if nothing had happened. The adrenaline was still there, but his face gave nothing away. Katrina watched him for a long moment before finally speaking. "They're not gonna stop, are they?" Vin exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "No, but neither am I." The morning light cast long shadows across the cafe as Katrina unlocked the front door, her movements slower than usual. She had barely slept. The events of the previous night replayed in her mind over and over. The bikers, the fight, the sheer ease with which Vin had handled them. It should have reassured her, but instead, it only made her more aware of the reality they were facing. This wasn't over. The Iron Fangs weren't just going to disappear. They had too much pride for that. And now, Vin Diesel had made himself their #1 enemy. As she stepped inside, she wasn't surprised to see him already sitting at his usual spot, a fresh cup of coffee in front of him. He was always here before anyone else, but today it felt different. He wasn't just here for his routine. He was here because he knew, just as she did, that trouble was far from over. Katrina walked behind the counter, setting down her bag. "You get any sleep?" Vin glanced up at her, then back at his coffee. "Didn't need it." She huffed a small laugh. "Yeah, that tracks." She poured herself a cup and leaned against the counter, looking at him. "So, what happens now?" Before Vin could answer, the door swung open again. This time it was Detective Alvarez. He stepped inside, scanning the cafe quickly before heading straight for Vin's table. "Morning, Diesel," Alvarez said, his tone already carrying the weight of bad news. Vin took a slow sip of his coffee before setting the cup down. "Detective." Alvarez didn't waste time. He pulled out a chair and sat across from Vin, folding his hands together on the table. "You know, I got a call last night. Witnesses said 5 guys showed up outside this cafe looking for payback. 4 of them ended up in the hospital. 1 walked away with a busted rib and a concussion." He leaned forward slightly. "That sound about right?" Vin didn't flinch. "Sounds like they made bad choices." Alvarez sighed, shaking his head. "You really don't like making things easy, do you?" Katrina walked over, crossing her arms. "What are you saying, Detective? That he should have let them trash this place? Hurt someone?" Alvarez exhaled, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "No, I'm saying that he just painted a big red target on his back. And maybe yours, too." Katrina's grip on her arms tightened, but she didn't look away. "We already had targets on our backs the moment those guys walked in here." Alvarez studied her for a second before looking back at Vin. "The Iron Fangs aren't small-time thugs. They've got connections. People in places that can make this messy. You humiliated them twice. They're not just going to come back with a couple more guys. They're going to bring a war." Vin finally leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. "Then let them?" Alvarez stared at him, expression unreadable. Then he let out a humorless chuckle. "You really don't get scared, do you?" Vin shook his head. I just don't back down. Alvarez looked like he wanted to argue, but then his radio crackled. He pulled it from his belt, listening for a moment before cursing under his breath. He stood abruptly. They just picked up one of the guys you put in the hospital last night, Alvarez said, sliding his radio back into place. And guess what? He's not pressing charges. Katrina frowned. Wait, what? Why wouldn't he? Alvarez gave her a grim look. Because guys like him don't go to the cops for justice. They go to people higher up in their chain. And if they're not pressing charges, that means they've got something else planned. Silence hung in the air. Alvarez sighed. I'll do what I can to keep eyes on them, but I'm telling you, get out of town. Both of you. Katrina opened her mouth to protest, but Vin was already shaking his head. Not happening. Alvarez exhaled sharply. Didn't think so. He pointed a finger at Vin. Then you better be ready, because when they come back, it won't be for a fight. It'll be for blood. With that, he turned and walked out, leaving behind the faint jingle of the door chime. Katrina exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over her face. Well, that's comforting. Vin took another sip of his coffee, then finally looked at her. You scared? She met his gaze, her jaw tightening. Yeah. Vin nodded. Good. Katrina blinked. Good? Vin set his cup down. Fear keeps you sharp, but don't let it stop you. She swallowed hard, then gave a small nod. Outside, the morning rush was beginning, the streets coming alive with people going about their day, unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface. But inside the cafe, one thing was clear. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. Some battles are fought with fists, others with courage. But one thing is clear. Standing up for what's right is never the wrong choice. What do you think about what happened? What would you have done? Share your thoughts in the comments, hit the like button, and don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories.